I think a lot of times pre-med students have a tendency to just do what other people around them are doing. I'm definitely have fallen guilty of that. But for the MCAT, I think it's extremely important to make sure How do you know when to take the MCAT? In today's video, I'm going to answer that question. Hello, my name is Nikhil. I'm a medical school applicant this cycle, so I know how nerve-wracking and difficult it can be to plan for the MCAT. Today, I want to go over a few things to consider before starting MCAT prep to make sure you are prepared and ready to take the exam and sign up for a test date. There are 3 specific questions you should be asking yourself before you set a schedule for your test. First, what pre-med requirement classes have you already taken, and when will you finish taking those classes? The MCAT tests all of the core science classes: chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. So making sure you've taken those classes either in high school or in college will set you up to do better on the MCAT. It makes sense, right? If you've taken something before once and you've already seen that kind of content, it's going to be easier to study it for the second time and master it for the MCAT. I would especially suggest this if you struggled in any of those classes. This means you might not have the basis necessary to be successful. So taking all the classes at least once ahead of time will hopefully give you that advantage so that you are ready the second time around. The second question you should be asking yourself is, when do you plan on applying to medical school? In my opinion, taking the MCAT and having your score before you actually submit your primary application is the best way to go. So for example, if you're applying for this next cycle, 2023, taking your MCAT this upcoming January or even in March or April is going to allow you to get your score back before you have to submit it to schools. Now, I know technically some students can elect to submit their MCAT and application at the same time without knowing their score, but if you take the MCAT later, you won't know what score you get when you submit it, which means that if you unfortunately do a little bit worse than anticipated, that entire cycle may not go the way that you would have hoped. Now, obviously, the MCAT is not the only thing that determines your medical school interviews and application cycle, but it is something to consider if you haven't thought of that before. One thing to remember is that you will not receive your score until a month after taking the test. So if you take the test in May, even though AMCAS opens up in June, you might not get the actual score back until mid-June. Just something to consider if you haven't heard of that before. And lastly, and this is something that I think is the most important, is finding the right time to study. I know that if you're in college studying for the MCAT, it can be really difficult to balance coursework and extracurriculars and add this stressful MCAT studying on top. So here are a few tips of going about it that might maximize your time. I took my MCAT in January, and part of the reason why was because I knew I would have winter break to prepare for the exam. And that's one way of going about it. If you take the test in January, I think the first test date this year is January 13th, you will at least have all of winter break to solely prepare on the MCAT as opposed to maybe schoolwork or coursework. Now, I know there are other things you might be doing, such as a job, and it might be hard to work around that, but at least trying to minimize the amount of commitments you have while taking the MCAT is something I would really highly recommend if possible. Now, obviously, I didn't start studying just during winter break, but I had that last 4 weeks to really go hard, which allowed me to learn things that maybe I was confused on and brush up on things without worrying about coursework or my grades or other things that mattered. But those last 4 weeks really allowed me to focus intensely on the test, which I think ended up being really great for me and why I was able to be successful. So like I mentioned before, there are test dates in March and April and May, but another thing to consider is that you're probably going to have classwork during that time or other things going on. So that might not be the best fit for you, especially if you feel like you can't commit the amount of time that you want. Other students do elect to take it a little bit earlier, but remember, the timing of the cycle matters. So for example, if you're planning to apply to medical school in the 2024 cycle, one way of going about it could be to take your MCAT in 2023 summer and get your score back. That way you have the entire summer to study and you can kind of get a little bit ahead of the game. But here's the conflicting part. If you maybe haven't taken biochemistry or one of your pre-med requirements, you might have a challenge there. So obviously there's a lot of factors here. This is why the decision can be kind of difficult. But what I would do is just make sure you're doing it on your own accord. I think a lot of times pre-med students have a tendency to just do what other people around them are doing. I'm definitely have fallen guilty of that. But for the MCAT, I think it's extremely important to make sure you're ready to take the test at your time and you're not just sort of following the Joneses, because everybody's situation is different and you should treat it that way. There's nothing wrong about it. I took my MCAT a year after most of my friends, and it didn't make my application any worse. So just something to consider. Make sure you're prepared for it. Make sure you have the time for it, and hopefully that will help you get the score that you want. Planning, I think, is a big part of setting yourself up for success on the MCAT. So I would spend a little bit of time thinking about this, maybe talking to your parents or friends and making sure they think it's the right fit for you. and just getting a little bit of feedback on this. If you feel like this is something you would want some extra help with, always feel free to reach out to TPC and we will hook you up with a coach who can help you talk through this and maybe sort out some other questions you have. But yeah, that's it for today's episode. Thank you guys for listening in. Let me know if you have any questions about this and if you have any suggestions for some topics we should cover in the following weeks. Peace.